Hi there. Welcome to Mushroom Hour. Today on the Mushroom Hour podcast, we are honored to be joined once again by our guests, Dr. Kay Mandrake and Virginia Hayes, authors of the Psilocybin Mushroom Bible, the Psilocybin Chef's Cookbook, and they are really psychedelic explorers and myconauts that I am excited to catch up with after about 3 years. So, Virginia, Dr. Mandrake, thanks for joining us on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having us. It's great to be here again.
Yes, and like I was saying before the show, a lot has changed since our past interview, so I just want to tell all listeners that you can find out more about Dr. K and Virginia's backstory on our episode 102 of the Mushroom Hour podcast, where we go into like the original version of the Psilocybin Bible and get a lot of their backstory. So go there and listen if you're interested in more of that background. And something I'm probably going to paste to the very beginning of this conversation: anything we talk about when it comes to psychedelics, psilocybin-containing mushrooms, none of this should be constituted as medical advice. No one is claiming they're a doctor. This is all for education and entertainment purposes only. We don't condone or condemn the use of these substances. So I want to put that caveat out there. But yeah, a lot has changed in the world since we last spoke. And I know there's a lot going on. I'm just curious. The thing I wanted to start with, there's an evolving landscape around psychedelics, psilocybin-containing mushrooms. What is that landscape today, or how do you guys engage with it? Because we have like varying levels of decriminalization, legalization. Now that's probably a much different landscape here than in the UK. And I know you've been writing about this a lot. So what is that current landscape in your mind? I guess we could start with that regulatory piece. Where is that in the conversation around psilocybin-containing mushrooms?
Yeah, so I guess I can probably take a bit of that, and Virginia can throw in any more ideas. Yeah, it's obviously very, very different than it was when we spoke like 3 or 4 years ago. And obviously when we read the book in like 2016, 2017, there's been a huge sea change. You know, there's been that whole... everyone's calling it the psychedelic renaissance. I think we were probably still calling it that back then. But, you know, it's a very different landscape now. There are lots of companies involved that weren't involved before. You know, the waves of decriminalization moving through like the US and Canada and things. The UK is not anywhere near that. You know, we still have like an approvals process for psilocybin, but it is pretty slow. So you are getting a few UK companies that are starting to look at psilocybin as treatment, but decriminalization is a long, long way, if any way, away in the UK. I don't know, Virginia, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, it still sucks in the UK. Yeah. I mean, we do have some cool people doing the research, like David Nutt, who I like talking about a lot because he's just a cool, nice older man, and he's been doing like good things for a long time. And like Robin Carhart Harris as well, who was, I can't remember which British university he is or was at, but yeah.
Yeah, I think it was Imperial.
Yeah, I don't know whether he just announced he's just moving somewhere else, but I wouldn't be surprised because the restrictions on this kind of research in the UK are still huge. So yeah, we kind of aren't seeing the movement that you are in the States, although I think there is a real big cultural shift. So I have so many more conversations about mushrooms with what I would consider to be my like straight friends, and by that I mean they're not people who take substances. They are
the squares.
Civilians, if you will. I have had so many conversations about like them as a potential medicine with people I don't think would have been ever really interested in before, in having this conversation before. And I kind of put that down to Michael Pollan. And, you know, the kind of Michael Pollan effect where suddenly a New York Times writer of a certain age who's white and a man and, you know, cisgender talks about these things, and all of a sudden they become like a topic, like an accessible topic for so many people. And, you know, you kind of hope that is the start of a kind of cultural shift. And as we do start to see, more kind of like great research coming out of places like the States where it's a bit easier to do it, then the culture will kind of demand better access in places like the UK.
And for a lot of substances, obviously we saw it with marijuana. Now with mushrooms here in the United States, it really starts in that medical model. What are the medical applications? How do we explore this as kind of a prescription-based medicine? Now, I know marijuana has had an interesting trajectory in the UK. I was a fan of like Black the Ripper, R.I.P. and kind of the whole movement there. Did you see some of that same thing? Does it really have to start with that medical model as well, you think, for governments or people to embrace it as kind of a legitimized thing on this path, maybe toward decriminalization? Does that really have to start there in the UK as well? Because I'm not sure if it did with marijuana like it did here, what that landscape's like.
I think... Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, like, it's very different. Like, even with cannabis here, the culture around it is so different to how it is in North America. And like, you just don't get people talking about medical marijuana in the same way here as you do in North America. Like, some people do, and especially with access to gummies and stuff. But yeah, there is a different way of doing it, and they do it in other European countries, right? Like, I think it's Portugal where they have decriminalized like all substances.
Right.
So you can do it a different way, but the politics here is just so conservative that I think the medical model is probably the best way in. But Dr. K and I both have reservations. Is that a good way to put it, Dr. K, about that?
Yeah, I think that's fair. It's like a yes and to the medical model. I think the medical model obviously has the potential to help a whole variety of people, but the medical model is a very new thing if we look like globally, and I think sometimes it can dominate the conversation a little bit in a way that maybe sort of sidelines other perspectives. What do you class as a medical experience? What do you class as a recreational experience? Are those two like cleanly separable with a line down the middle? If you have a breakthrough experience when you're taking magic mushrooms at a retreat or a festival or something, have you had a medical experience? And vice versa, if you just laugh your ass off through a medical session, is that a medical experience? So I think, again, it kind of setting is such a beautiful way of framing this. You can't really outline one thing from the other. And then obviously there's the whole sort of indigenous wisdom side of it, which seems kind of insulting to say, well, this has been done for hundreds of years in certain cultural contexts, but the medical model is the only thing that gives it legitimacy. And, I don't think that's necessarily fair, whilst being fully supportive of any way to help people.
Yeah.
It definitely brings up questions, though, around like who's well, and who's not well. So why is it that you have to have a diagnosis of a particular condition or, however you want to phrase that? Why do you have to be unwell, in huge inverted commas, for you to have access to something that could help you? If I think about the people who've reached out to me kind of about what shrooms might do for them in the last 6 months, I have I have a friend who's a teacher of kids with severe and complex needs, which is a very demanding job. Lots of stress involved, lots of responsibility, lots of, needing to help families who aren't getting enough help from the system and stuff like this. And that friend was saying, do you think that something like microdosing could help me? And that person isn't unwell. They're just struggling with the things that we all struggle with in, their particular circumstance. And you think, well, if it's beneficial, then surely everyone could have it. And I know that the medical model is kind of potentially how we get there, but it's still to be proven whether that will kind of lead to more open access.
And when you said that, there's a couple things I do want to ask you guys about what you think about the rise of microdosing, because that is kind of exploding everywhere, especially where I am. Just a reminder, we're broadcasting on 103.3 here in KPCA in Petaluma, California, in Sonoma County, which this Bay Area, Greater Bay Area, is kind of an epicenter of some of this culture. So I was curious to what you guys think about that. But when you're thinking about the medical model too, what springs to mind is, harms and harm reduction. And, you wonder if there's a burden on regulators or people who want to kind of shoehorn it into this model. Is there a burden of proof of what the harms even are? When we think about legislation, and maybe this is like ridiculous on its face because we all know the legislation is outdated and doesn't really track with reality, but I'm not sure that we've ever proven, the extent of what quote unquote the harms are compared to other substances that people use to deal with some of those same issues. Like you're saying, day-to-day stress and anxiety. People use sugar, alcohol, coffee. I'm not sure that we've proven that psilocybin containing mushrooms have more harms than those substances. So it's interesting that we have to kind of prove some kind of medical benefit. Well, I'm not sure we've established that it hurts someone, first of all, in order to outlaw it.
Yeah, I mean, there's a really good example of that in the UK. There's a group of, I think it's like a think tank, who want to get the medical model going a bit more in the UK. And they've put out a report that basically states that, there are very low harm potentials for psilocybin containing mushrooms and, the pure substance itself. And their evidence for that is drawing on, decades of recreational use and, hospital admissions and that sort of thing. But then in the same document, they managed to turn it around and say, but no, we need to still control it through a medical model because of unanticipated harms. And it's a really frustrating read because you're like, well, you can't have it both ways. You can't look to the recreational community for your examples of low harm and then throw that same recreational community back into the abyss because you want to have full control of it in a medical context, which, if you're being really cynical, allows you to extract more profit, allows you to do certain things by sort of cutting off a lot of people from that access and controlling limited access and that market sort of thing. So yeah, I see what you're saying. It is really frustrating.
Yeah, that paper sounds like the exact embodiment of what I'm talking about. So very interesting. I'd love to link that in the show notes or something like that. But yeah, microdosing, obviously we hear about it a lot here. We've seen so many advocacy groups arise around it, but it's also like the trendy, cool, like podcaster host type generation thing to talk about is like microdosing every day and what that does. How do you guys see that culture evolving? Is it purely positive? Do you think there's any issues with how that is being presented? Just what's your take on that? Because it is such a big topic.
Well, I know that Dr. K will want to talk about a particular bit of research that we know about that I think perhaps is might be unpopular with people who love microdosing. I think a critique that you kind of don't really see of the whole concept of microdosing is that it seems to be pushing people towards like productivity. You know what I mean? It's like subsumed into like Silicon Valley culture of like it can make you better at your job and it can, make you more productive at work. And if you work for a startup, maybe you can come up with brilliant ideas in the 80-hour work week that you're putting yourself through. And I always cringe a little bit because I'm like, I don't really feel like that's the kind of point of shrooms, but each to their own. You can't police what people do. But yeah, there was Kay, do you want to talk about the research that I'm thinking of?
Yeah, so I'm a bit more cautious with microdosing. Like, I think bottom line for anything, and I think this applies to some, whether you want to call them medicinal mushrooms, functional mushrooms, like other species that people talk about, is like sort of proving that benefit. And I'll underline all this by saying that if you feel a benefit from it and it's not costing you a ridiculous amount of money, it's something you're willing to spend your money on, and no one is telling you should do it in lieu of a medication that might be actually helping you, then
Yes.
I'd say it's fine. Microdose as much as you want. If you feel a benefit from it, absolutely great. However, there are a few bits of research coming through or have been coming through, and they mostly get ignored because they don't fit within the narrative of microdose promotion and how people want to talk about microdosing. And when you look at double-blind placebo-controlled trials, which are essentially your gold standard of scientific evidence. So double-blind is everyone involved doesn't know who's in the placebo group. And placebo-controlled means you have a portion of those people who are receiving a sugar pill, essentially, an inactive dose. And there's been some pretty smart methodology done around microdosing studies recently that allow them to administer placebo doses without being in control of people's doses, because that's the tricky thing is because of the legal restrictions, a lot of times they can't supply the dosage for people. They're just like, oh, hey, if you're going to do this microdosing regimen, here's a protocol you can follow and then report to us the results, but we won't tell you where to get it from. And when they've done that, they've found some really interesting results in that it seems like it's mostly people's expectations of microdosing that are leading them to report their positive findings. And this one study in particular, again, I can link it in the show notes. Some of the quotes from the participants in there is really astounding. They just cannot believe that they were in the placebo group because they were so convinced. And, I think the broader narrative around microdosing just perpetuates that effect. And again, like I say, that's not a false effect. You're not I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with anyone experiencing the placebo effect. It's absolutely a real effect. It's just the cause isn't what we think it is. So I'm a bit cautious around microdosing. Again, if people are trying to sell it to people or if people are trying to get them to come off other medication and do microdosing instead, that's when I'd sort of pull back and ask more questions. But if people want to do it, I think it's fine.
I understand that, if you're hearing that as a proponent of microdosing or someone who has tried microdosing and found positive effect from it, it might seem like a real downer, but I actually think it's the opposite. I think it's incredible. What we're talking about there is the power of your expectation is actually causing you to feel these things. So the placebo effect, I think people use it as a negative thing, but actually it's incredible. It's that all this change is coming from you, from your expectation, from your belief it will happen, which actually makes you really powerful in that kind of situation.
Absolutely. And then if there are real effects, it's enhancing those, right? Maybe your microdose is a loci for your brain to fully activate in either one or many ways. Well, and thank you both for giving us such good perspective. And thank you, Dr. Mandrake. You are truly the doctor for grounding us in some of the research to kind of explicate these themes that I'm kind of picking up on and helps us give something to more that in. And Virginia, I love your point about being conscripted into commercialism or being conscripted into modernity. It's microdosing is going to make you a better worker. And, the thing I'm starting to see now, I think it's companies coming out of Canada. I know some here. I don't know if they're totally above board or not, but selling microdoses or microdose stacks, right? This has niacin and lion's mane and a little bit of this microdose. Buy it. And it suddenly becomes this product-based interface instead of, we really love these organisms. We want this to be free. And, it's all of it has to be molded into our modern model. Maybe that's just the way of things, but man, with something like fungi and these powerful substances we're talking about, you hate to see it. You hate to see it fall to those kind of restrictions.
Yeah, for sure. I think some of those microdose sales, I know in Canada certainly, some of them are inviting legal challenges. So there's a little motive to it that's maybe less commercial. But obviously, if it was commercial, the same things would be happening there too. But I know some places are setting up microdosing services as a way to. There's a particular lawyer whose name escapes me again. I can look them up and share it later. But yeah, he's using it as a way to kind of bring a legal challenge, because then you can make those arguments in a courtroom, and you can talk about low harm, low potential for abuse, that sort of thing, in a way that doesn't let you really put that voice to people in power. You know what I
Interesting.
mean? Like, in a way that's a bit more like willing to have a fight a little bit legally, which I think is quite interesting.
Set some precedent, yeah. Well, and we've been talking then about microdosing, and that's really interesting to think about trying to pull this into a courtroom so you can prove some of these things on the record. That's really interesting. But obviously, you guys are kind of in the heart of the cultivation community as well. People who have been interested, right, since time immemorial, but definitely in the US since the 1960s was the rise of cultivation of Psilocybe, usually cubensis. It's something that's always been a huge underground network. You guys are firmly in that by publishing really one of the best books. It truly is the Psilocybe Mushroom Bible in terms of cultivation. Where do you see that community today? Are you seeing kind of emerging crazy technology? Are you seeing kind of big commercial players as some of these markets open up where it's now legal, like Canada and the US? Are you seeing bigger players come in and introduce new technologies or push people out? Or just what are some of those dynamics in this kind of big underground but slowly surfacing world of psilocybin containing mushroom cultivation?
Yeah, I guess I can take that one. Yeah, I think from a cultivation perspective, broadly speaking, there are lots of companies coming in doing lots of different things, and you could almost have an hour-long conversation about people providing retreats, people providing equipment. There's been a real sort of diversification of people doing stuff around mushrooms. And I think just to take it back to like a growing level, you've seen a lot more companies coming in and supplying people with things that back when we were first growing sort of 10, 15 years ago, we had to make everything ourselves. So it's nice to see that, there are companies out there that can supply these things now. And as I've gotten into various aspects of cultivation, I definitely see the benefit in having someone else make my agar plates for me or my substrate or something like that, because, there's a particular thing that you're interested in, and doing everything is quite overwhelming. So that's something we kind of really put forwards in the book, is that there's no harm in, just because we teach you how to do most things doesn't mean you have to do everything. But equally, we would say to everyone, just give it a try first and see how taxing it might be before you decide to go and like buy something in. But if that's something you want to do, then totally understandable. We just kind of give people the options.
It's like learning to drive in a manual rather than an automatic, right? Like, yeah, maybe an automatic's going to be easier, but one day you might have to drive a manual, and then you're not going to know you're not going to know how to do it. Can you tell I still have a manual car and will not get rid of it?
So do I. I'm with you.
But I would say, just to add on to what Kay says, there's like the availability of like pre-made things and, mixes and things like this are really helpful in a way. It can just be people spending a hell of a lot of money that they actually don't need to spend, because someone who starts home cultivation goes on and like Googles what they need, and instead of kind of looking what they can buy themselves and put together, they then end up shelling out for this product that promises to be like a sterile medium, and it ends up to be not sterile, but they don't know how to ascertain where the issue came from if they end up with like a ruined grow. And some of the things people are buying now are just like legit dangerous. Like you see so many like UV sterilization kits now, and you're like, that's like straight up really dangerous for you. You should not have that kind of thing in your home. I mean, Kay has worked with these in labs where like you have to leave the room before you use them, right, Kay?
Yeah, I mean, you've seen people get burns from these things now, and I think some of it's off the back of COVID as well. People selling more general, like, sanitizing equipment, but they found their way into mushroom growing, and people want to use these UV sterilization ones, and the thing is, you don't know they're doing damage until a bit later on, so it's kind of like a really, really, really bad sunburn. I've heard of people working under these lamps because they think that's how they're meant to use them. And then, hours later, suddenly their skin is burning, it's itchy, they've damaged their eyes, they get temporary blindness and things. So, yeah, some of it is like you've got to be really careful with what you use. That's not to say that everything you use in mushroom growing is that dangerous, but that's something I think that we really try to point out to people is you don't need these UV sterilizing lamps because they're probably going to do more damage than help your grow.
I had never heard of that before, and that's why I'm so glad I asked the question. But that's really what I like about your book is you do show kind of the quote unquote Home Depot, like DIY version of building everything yourself and really educate people on the process of cultivating any mushroom, right? Of starting with whatever your sterilized growth medium is, kind of going out onto your fruiting substrate and developing everything from there. I think people need to start with that basic understanding. And that's why the DIY can be a great way to learn what doesn't work. It's almost like if you had someone give you all the tools to do it and it always worked right your first time, I don't think you would know as much. It's like, I want to fail a couple times. And you talk about this a lot in the book. You want to fail a couple times and really get your grasp on the process that much better before you engage in it. Now, obviously that's, what I'm referencing is the Psilocybe Mushroom Bible. Again, for anybody listening, we're talking to Dr. Kay Mandrake. We're talking to Virginia Hayes, authors of the Psilocybin Mushroom Bible. That book is fantastic. You can just Google those words, and we'll give the website at the end for more information. But now you guys are in the process of updating that work. So maybe what was the impetus for that, or what does the update focus on? Because the book came out in 2016. We've just been talking about like the cultural explosion. I'm sure there's been innovation by home cultivators that, have read your book and taken things that much further. But what does the update of the book look like, and what was the impetus for that?
I was just going to say, I think the impetus was 8 years is a hell of a long time in this world, and there's been so many changes. We've learned so much as well. We wanted to go to kind of new areas that we hadn't discussed in the first book, so maybe we can talk about a couple of those in a sec. But it was also to kind of fix like a couple of errors. Like there was for the PF Tech recipe in the first book, we had written at some point that you needed to add some coffee, and then not written in the method where the coffee went. And I can't tell you how many hundreds of Instagram messages that I've had about this particular emission that we just forgot to put in. And I was like, we need to fix this. It's absolutely driving me crazy. So yeah, a couple of things that were just missed out in the first edition. We have updated we've really gone over everything and updated it with all the most recent research that we know of, the ways that methods have changed just because of the different availability of different things and the kit you can now get. And, people aren't really going to head shops anymore to get these things. They're buying online. How do you get spores and things? All of this is a really changing marketplace. It's a really changing landscape. And then, yeah, we wanted to push people to go beyond what they might be comfortable with as well. I'm thinking about, we've got an entire chapter on wood lovers, and the start of that chapter says okay, you've learned so much about sterilization, now throw away everything you think you know about mushroom growing and sterilization, because you're going to need to think completely differently in this chapter.
I'm super intrigued, and I want to make sure we cover that. When we talk about wood lovers, are we talking about, Psilocybe species that just grow on wood instead of the complex substrate, most commonly known as manure of some kind, that the cubensis were used to? Is that kind of the hardwood species or the wood species you're focusing on, whether that's cyanescens or something like that?
Yeah, basically. I mean, there's a huge diversity of wood-loving species, and for me, the book really sort of charts our process over the last 8 years, or certainly my process with just wanting to learn more. My background is environmental science and ecology. So that's the kind of route I go down, is learning about different species and maybe how to cultivate them. So wood lovers was one, and just realizing the benefit of them. I think lots of people follow the grow specifications for cubensis and the manure lovers, but mainly Psilocybe cubensis is the main one. But just realizing that you can grow on wood and it doesn't have to be indoors gives you some more possibilities. And it's also a great opportunity with wood lovers in particular to talk about growing local species. I know last time we were on, we talked about growing seasonally. And this time, I think the biggest introduction to like ecology and mushrooms out in the environment and what the environment is like for mushrooms is through wood lovers. And it's like fascinating because suddenly then you're learning, okay, where do wood lovers grow? What trees do they like to grow with? What's the forest like? So for me, it's been a little opportunity to talk a bit more broadly around like mushrooms out in the environment, which is a big passion of mine that you don't really get to talk about so much when you're just talking about growing in jars in, you know, your basement or wherever you happen to be growing. So yeah, it was a really exciting and fun chapter to write.
I also think when we wrote the first edition, we had like no idea it was gonna be this huge deal. Like we could never have guessed or even hoped that it was going to be like a bestseller, that we would have sold, you know, this many copies, that it would reach this many people. And I think we were kind of really acutely aware of our responsibility in that, not only to get the science right and to, you know, to make sure people are doing this safely and thinking about it safely, but to think about it in a more sustainable way. You know, how do you approach your mushroom growing if you think, you know, that you're growing from home so it doesn't really have an environmental impact? Like it really does. We talk as well about things like using peat in your grow and, you know, the amount of single-use plastics that you just go through as a mushroom grower if you don't think about it, when there are other options available. And also just like as a consumer of shrooms, let's say, you know, you've got to think about who has use these substances for a long time. You know, is the access to them, if it comes, is it going to be equal? Is it not going to be equal? What can you do to think about everybody kind of as a whole, as people who should have access to this, rather than, you know, just kind of sitting back and not seeing yourself as as part of the huge ecosystem.
Absolutely. I'm not surprised you guys have kind of integrated that conversation, because I think that's been big recently in psychedelics generally, but especially in psilocybin containing mushrooms, is advocacy for access for all groups, right? That element of diversity to like, this is not kind of a white man's discipline. Like engaging with these mushrooms did not start or end with the Western world. This should include everybody and be accessible to everybody. So I'm not surprised that worked its way in there. And Dr. K, I love hearing about that outdoor cultivation, because yes, for so many people who think of growing any kind of psilocybin containing mushrooms, images come in their head of working with petri dishes, but then expanding onto, like you said, jars or plastic tubs that lives in a closet somewhere. And that's kind of how these things are grown, because as a Western world, we're most familiar with Psilocybe cubensis, right? And that needs the manure, and that's the kind of grow system that was pioneered, you could argue, but but you know, that book by Terrence and Dennis McKenna, and I forget the pen names they used, kind of started some of that technique. And that's just what everybody did because that was tried and true. But really, there are so many more species of psilocybin containing mushrooms, especially in the wild, more potent species. And so I love this idea of expanding people's repertoire into thinking about outdoor cultivation. That's something that I love anyway. Outdoor cultivation of mushrooms is like something I'm passionate about, whether that's garden giant in your garden or making beds of mushrooms that love hardwood on some hardwood chips. I mean, whatever the case is. But give us an example of that, maybe, if you can, a little sneak peek of what does that quote unquote tech look like? Is it expanding from a petri right onto the relevant like hardwood chips, or what does that look like? I'm really curious.
Yeah, so I guess like the lowest tech version of it is going out into the wild, finding a wood-loving species that grows in your natural environment, taking a little chunk of that wood and putting it somewhere else. One of the things around Psilocybe cyanescens and some other wood lovers is, there's a great word for it. I think it's called synanthropy, which is species that are able to grow in human cultivated habitat. So you've got pigeons, rats, foxes, but also many wood lovers will grow on sort of your mulched landscape garden. We call it like the the natural equivalent of like elevator music, you know, like just beige brown landscape.
Yeah.
So taking a bit of wood lovers from their natural environment, which might be a parking lot, it might be somewhere in the forest, and moving that around a little bit with a bit more intentionality is like the easiest way to do that. Now, it's not always the most successful way, and we kind of talk about ways in the book to sort of scale it up. You can definitely bring it back into the lab and do some lab work, clean the cultures up, because they are very, very laden with all sorts of contamination. So you really need to like be very on top of your lab skills if you want to get a clean culture out of it, which you can then reintroduce back into the natural environment. But you don't always have to go down that route. It's sort of gives you a few different options of the ways you can take it and sort of just grow it in big tubs in like a garage or somewhere like that, and then either keep growing in those tubs or move those tubs out into a forest or a bit of landscaping and let it take off and do its thing.
I love that. And I love the ecological tie-in. Like you said, this is a way to kind of get people more out into the world thinking about ecology, thinking about outdoor cultivation, because what we're talking about, psilocybe cultivation is, let's face it, a touchstone and a starting point for so many people's relationships with fungi more broadly, and then with nature more broadly. So I love seeing that weaving its way into your writings and some of your goals there. In Virginia, you mentioned something interesting about responsibility. And I'm curious, maybe talk a little bit more about how that shows up for you, or how you think about your responsibility in communicating this information. And then maybe what you guys are doing outside of the book to kind of create community around this, if you feel like that's necessary, that you guys have to be like some digital center of gravity around community. But I know I referenced the Substack earlier. I know that you guys have thought about like how we can put together some information outside of just the book. So yeah, just talk about responsibility and maybe how you've tried to give out some good information, be responsible about communicating this information, and help create like a locus of community that embodies that.
Well, I think, in the last kind of 8 years since the book originally came out, we kind of became a little like center of, information naturally through like social media. I mean, that is how people communicate with us most readily. And I was just kind of like really taken aback and a little bit concerned about the kind of questions people were asking us. So people would get in touch and you could see that they didn't have a lot of experience taking mushrooms or taking anything else really, but they were in a really vulnerable place and coming to us with quite a lot of pain, and maybe they'd been dealing with a particular issue for a long time, and they would send us messages asking things like, if I come off my medication and take some shrooms, will I fix my brain, was the kind of phrase that kept coming up. And I felt, it's like really heartbreaking. Someone's really in a difficult place there and reaching out to you. And you see the ways that person could be taken advantage of by someone who is just trying to sell them a product. Someone who, let's take the microdosing example. They might just see that person as a customer. That's kind of never been how we've done anything, and we don't have a product to sell them. We only have the book. But it does really put you in a position where you go, oh, people are really coming to us, and we need to be really thoughtful about how we tell them, the things we have to tell them, like, please don't come off your medication. Like, we're not medical doctors. This isn't a decision you should just take on the hope that like taking a week's worth of microdoses will help you through an issue you might have been struggling with for decades. There is no magic bullet for all of these conditions. When people get over things, it's often through therapy, it's often through changing their circumstances, it's about having connection with people in the real world, it's about getting out of dangerous situations. And yeah, something like mushrooms can be a part of that, but you're going to have to change a lot of things in your life, and you really need to be resilient to people who might want to take advantage to you. So it's kind of always been there in how we communicate with people. The Substack is kind of like a new thing we're doing as a way to move that off social media, I guess, and into people's inboxes and onto their Substack app. And it just gives us a bit more space to be like reactive and responsive. So putting a book out every 8 years is great, but it doesn't let you be kind of like immediate. So if some things come up in the news or something's happened, you really want to be able to speak to it and be like, okay, so we have actually looked at this paper, or, you know, we've thought about this for a long time. Here's some things we think you should consider. You know, let's not get really excited about this and jump on the hype train and throw all our critical thinking out of the way, or forget that people around us need us to be responsible humans in the way we engage with the world, including with mushrooms. So yeah, it's also like something we're completely in control of. So we've never really had an issue with people telling us what we can or can't write, but it just can't happen here. So we can just be like, no, we're saying this, which is really nice.
Absolutely. And in so much of what you were saying, it really takes that next level of what I want to say, of kind of challenging yourself to take this information, this topic you're passionate about that has been neglected or taboo, that has been so potent and powerful, especially around psychedelics, where kind of the first instinct is, oh my gosh, let's kick off all this civilization, all of this modernity that's been holding us back. Let's ditch these systems. This is the new thing. These substances are opening me up to a whole different way of being. But to then say, okay, well, hold on. We do need to contextualize this into the way things are today, the way our society and our cultures work today, and to communicate the safeguards that are part of that society that actually grew up for good reason. I mean, certain things, certain amounts of taking a measured approach to things happen for good reason, because we can get excited and run too far with an idea and kind of throw the baby out with the bathwater and leave behind some of the important parts. So I really appreciate you taking that time to think about, don't just throw all your prescriptions away and say doctors have no idea what they're talking about. Big pharma is evil. I'm just eating mushrooms all the time. It's like, hold on. Don't throw away everything good here. There are good parts of this. You need to contextualize your new relationship with these substances with your kind of extant human cultural pieces. You can't just throw it all away. So I appreciate people being able to take the time to do that and to communicate that, because like Dr. K was saying earlier, let's go into some of the research, and what is that telling us? Oh, it's something I didn't necessarily expect when I was first running away with my passion about this idea. So it really takes that next level of thinking to really try to integrate. Yeah, integration, right? We're talking about psychedelics. We got to talk about to integrate these into our cultural context.
Yeah, and I think taking what we were talking about earlier about harm reduction, I think part of that is broadening what we consider to be harm reduction as well. Because I think when people think about harm reduction, they usually think about, well, does it negatively affect us in a physical way? You can think of, people with alcoholism, or, the dangers of tobacco. But you take it out a step further and you think, well, okay, what is this like wave of hype telling people, and what is it not telling people? Because sometimes, especially, I think this is where our context being in the UK comes from, is there'll be documentaries talking about the great effects of magic mushrooms or all mushrooms, and people will be very lighthearted about it, which is great, but they don't always mention that there's still places where this is very, very illegal. And if you were to watch those documentaries and take them at face value, you might be like, well, okay, I'm going to start growing and do this and do that. And what we like to say to people is, well, consider the implications of anything that you're doing. And that's a harm reduction step in and of itself. Like, whilst you're telling people, hey, shrooms are great, you're like, but in these situations, you might get yourself into trouble, and be really aware of that and really think through the context, and don't just follow blindly along the river of hype that's sort of pouring out around these substances.
I think what we're also trying to do is like encourage people to think critically. And I mean that in terms of like where they get their information, because it's incredible that there are so many people writing about shrooms and talking about shrooms, and so the information on, how to have a good trip, what these things will do for you, and even how to grow them is so much more accessible. But also we're living in a time where Google can't be trusted as much as it used to. And, the advent of AI is actually really dangerous when you're talking about things like mushrooms. There's so many like weird rip-off versions of our book have sprung up in the last kind of like 3 or 4 years.
Wow.
And some of them you can see are like written by AI, and the information that they've scraped out of our book somehow is then put across in a way that is incorrect. And that is straight up dangerous. And you really want people to kind of see that what we're talking about has grounding. Like we're not just saying things, we go and we read the papers and we try things and we do them and we try and think about it in a real, in a holistic way. Everything we do, we try and bring it back to science, bring it back to evidence, and bring it back to like the real effects on you and in the world. And we're kind of losing the ability to do that, I think. Not the ability, we're losing the tools to do that, I suppose.
Just to remind all of our listeners, on 103.3 KPCA in Petaluma, you're listening to the Mushroom Hour. We're talking with Dr. Kay Mandrake and Virginia Hayes, authors of the Psilocybin Mushroom Bible. But we're talking about some of the sensationalism, the regulatory frameworks, how to approach these topics in a way that really you have some grounding. And Virginia, you're just talking about critical thinking. I mean, we're in an era where it's sensationalism rules. I mean, the fact that you guys have a measured approach and you're looking at the arguments where maybe microdosing isn't a panacea. I mean, people want to switch away from that on their app and they want to see the person telling them that it is utopia and everything's amazing. For me, I love it. I love hearing the skepticism. I love hearing the arguments against something that, or not against something, but the arguments that give us pause or take a measured approach. But I think so many people and so many algorithms, maybe more importantly, favor people that are just clear cut, full speed ahead, not taking any of those considerations. So in that landscape, what are maybe we can call these Virginia's tenets of critical thinking, but what are the ways that you kind of think critically about this information, or what would be advice to people who want to kind of filter through the AI generated BS about psilocybin mushrooms, or people that are way too sensational? Are there any guideposts that you can think of to help guide people in these topics?
I think the first one is like, whatever you read, any kind of claim that you read kind of anywhere, can you find another person saying it? And not just like a random, nameless person on what I like to think of as God's green internet, but like a person who is attached to an institution, or a person who has developed a body of work that you can see is legitimate, a person who is accountable, a person who has like a public face even, who people will have already gone over their work. Is the claim traceable back to something or someone in the real world? Now that doesn't fix the problem, because a lot of people who are public and are accountable and are attached to institutions will say things that might not be grounded in science or reality, but it's a pretty good way to start. It's kind of number one, if you will. Number two is like, can you find counterclaims? Can you see people discussing this issue somewhere, so you can at least read kind of both sides of it? And, I would say to people, research papers aren't that difficult to read. When you're getting into like deep science, it can be quite intimidating if you're not from like a science background, like I'm not, Dr. K is. But they are more accessible than you think. So you can actually go back and read research that's being cited to see if that's kind of what you take away from it as well. But Kay, what's your advice?
Yeah, I think jumping off the sort of readability of science, as someone who has a science background and fully understands how boring scientific papers sort of present themselves, but there's a reason that they do that, to reduce sensationalism, to make reading one paper and another paper like standardized and approachable, even if it's not obvious at face value. But one thing I would say is like, there is a real problem with access to science right now. We have publishing houses of scientific papers extracting huge amounts of value off the backs of works of scientists who mostly get their wages paid through like grant funding or taxpayer funding. They write the papers themselves, they review the papers themselves as a group of, interested, passionate individuals. And then that knowledge then gets paywalled. And I always have a real problem with whether that's ethical thing. And there are ways to access papers that are out there. Sometimes the scientists themselves will give you the papers, but that's also becoming quite difficult with publishing houses wanting to keep their stronghold on knowledge, basically, and money. So I think being able to get hold of that science isn't always the easiest, but there are ways to do it. There's obviously open source science as well. Now you're seeing a lot more citizen science. It's getting easier to publish, which is both good and bad. You need to kind of amp up your sort of critical sensitivity there a little bit with certain publications, but you're seeing preprint servers, which are something that kind of came out of the era of COVID, which was to get information out to people very quickly, but with the caveat that it's not been reviewed as dedicated in as much of a dedicated way as a standard scientific paper would be. So you can now get preprint servers for various bits of information, but again, applying that sort of critical thought, just knowing what your sources are, what the difference between these things are, can be quite academic and quite dull. But once you have that information, once you have that understanding, you can use it in such a powerful way.
Absolutely. And I love that you guys are basically giving pretty much the best advice always when you're assessing claims is, as much as we want to mistrust institutions, go to people who have become part of an institution, who have the discipline and rigor of some kind of background that's really informed them on whatever you're asking about, and go to those voices to see what they have said. Go to ResearchGate or Google Scholar, type in the topic you're interested in. In this case, it would be psilocybin containing mushrooms. But I do appreciate you bringing up that point about kind of open source science, or the lack thereof, right, of gate-kept scientific papers. And I love that train of thought you were laying out, that, look, we as taxpayers paid for the research grant. Now we should get the data, not be hid behind a journal paywall. And interviewing Vera Meyer, a German scientist who did a lot of work with Aspergillus and does a lot of work now with mycelium materials. She was very passionate about this issue and said, I'm only ever publishing on open source kind of open source platforms from now on for that reason. So you also highlighted kind of a bigger issue, I think, in science. And when you talk about community science, I know you guys are familiar with the work of like Hyphae Labs, the folks doing psilocybin testing, and now other compounds, mushroom testing, fungi testing more broadly here in Oakland, California. Without going through the exhaustive list, maybe someone who might be underappreciated, might not already be a huge name in like a social media sphere or a resource, or even if they are, just a resource that you guys think, man, we're so lucky to have this person who's not necessarily a professional putting out good information or putting something together like that. Any resources like that you guys want to share? Maybe we'll start with you, Virginia.
This is probably too mainstream for me to put as an answer to this question, but I'm going to anyway.
There's no too mainstream.
It's a competitor, so I shouldn't really say. But I really like it's called the Microdose. It's a Substack that's coming out of, I think, UC Berkeley. And they are talking about like not just shrooms, but all kinds of like psychedelic research and stuff. That's not citizen science at all. But for that, I'm going to pass over to Kay.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've mentioned some great ones already. Like the work of Hyphae Labs is really incredible to see them come in through in the last couple of years. I think we were just starting to talk about them on the last podcast, and they've done a few cups and things. So yeah, I would re-emphasize their work, and I think the work that they do and the reports they put out are really inspiring. Obviously, I would say Alan Rockefeller is always someone great to follow in the space, and a lot of work he does around new species. If we jump over to Australia, you've got the work of Cain Barlow and Simon Beck around things like wood lovers paralysis. And generally, I think it's Entheogenesis Australia is the name of the organization. And they do some great work over there. And there's a whole diversity of wood lovers in Australia that isn't as prominent in other areas of the world. So if you're into that sort of thing, follow some of the work that they do. There's probably more. I know as soon as I hang up, I'll think of like 5 more, but yeah.
Of course, that's always how it is. But entheogenesis in Australia, we'll include that in the show notes as well. I think, some great resources. And again, it's that clarion call to when there is a topic like this that you're so passionate about, and you hear bits and pieces on social media or on podcasts talking about the benefits of psilocybin-containing mushrooms, the benefits of microdosing. Just take that next step and really do some research yourself. Read about it for a few hours. And you know what? You will learn so much, and it's such a worthy endeavor. Even if you get some of your kind of aspirational notions torn apart by reality, that's fine, because there's tons of interesting information that you're going to find about biology and ecology and so much more. So I just love your guys' grounded approach to these topics. I think that's why it's so valuable to bring you on for, as many mushroom hours as you're ever willing to do to talk about these things. Remind people where they can learn more information about the book, about your guys' work. Where are the best places to go to find all that information?
So for the book, the second edition of the book is coming out next month, we hope. And if you just search, I hate to say it, but Amazon would be the place to go and look for that. But our Substack is called A Quickly Changing Kaleidoscope. And yeah, if people want to, you can be a free subscriber for that. So that's like, kind of open access, like, join us. We would love to see you there. And yeah, you can just look at that on Substack.
Beautiful. Well, as I've said many times, I highly encourage everybody to go to check out your work if you're interested at all in these topics. Again, that caveat that we're not advocating anybody cultivate anything or engage in any federally or regionally illegal activities, but this is a topic that is emerging more and more in our collective consciousnesses. Everyone's talking about it, so I think it behooves you to get educated with good information like Virginia and Dr. Mandrake advocate for. So just to remind people, you've been listening to the Mushroom Hour here on KPCA in Petaluma. We've interviewed Dr. K. Mandrake and Virginia Hayes. For more information, you can go to welcometomushroomhour.com to see all the show notes and all the links. Thank you so much, Virginia and Dr. Mandrake, for coming on the show. It has been a joy, as always, and so much information. Thank you for being on the podcast.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us. That was great.